Chapter 8. To the South Col, 1953. After 1950, Western climbers could no longer enter Tibet, but they could enter Nepal. In 1951, a British expedition went to the southern side of Everest for the first time. And in 1952, a Swiss climber called Raymond Lambert made an attempt on the summit with Tenzing Norgay. Tenzing was one of the Sherpa people of Nepal, who are excellent climbers and know the mountains well. Together, Lambert and Tenzing almost reached the summit. But their oxygen equipment was not working well, and at the highest camp they had no sleeping bags. So, at 8,597 meters, just a few meters higher than Norton had gone in 1924, they turned back. In 1953, John Hunt came to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, with a large British expedition. Tenzing Norgay joined them here, and the expedition set out for Thangboche, a monastery south of Everest. The walk took 17 days, and 350 porters were needed to carry their equipment. In Thangboche, they were joined by two New Zealand climbers, Edmund Hillary and George Lowe. The climbers spent 3 weeks at base camp, getting used to the thin mountain air. They climbed smaller mountains of about 6,000 meters, learning to use the oxygen equipment. John Hunt thought that Tenzing Norgay was stronger than anyone. Their first problem was to find a way up the Khumbu icefall onto the Khumbu Glacier. The Khumbu Glacier is a slow-moving river of ice, and the Khumbu icefall is a large wall of broken ice. This icefall is over 300 meters high, 6 times higher than Niagara Falls, and the ice in it moves very slowly all the time. There are pieces of ice as big as houses, which could fall on the climbers' heads at any moment. There are avalanches of ice that could kill a man in a second. Terrible crevasses go hundreds of meters down into the blue-green darkness under the climbers' feet. Sometimes the climbers heard ice moving far below them. The climbers and Sherpas carried loads of over 18 kilograms up this difficult route. They made Camp 2 halfway up the icefall at 5,915 meters, and Camp 3 at the top of the icefall at 6,158 meters. Then they climbed up the glacier to Camp 4 at 6,462 meters, and Camp 5 at 6,705 meters. The next big problem was to climb the Lhotse face to the South Col. High above Camp 5 is the mountain of Lhotse, 8,500 meters. To the left of Lhotse is the South Col of Everest. The first 600 meters of the Lhotse face is a steep slope of ice, the Lhotse Glacier. This ice is very difficult to climb, with many ice walls and deep crevasses. For 11 long days, the New Zealander George Lowe and the Sherpa Anulu fought their way up this wall of ice. All the way, they cut steps in the ice and fixed ropes for the others to follow them. They made Camp 6 at 7,010 meters, and Camp 7 at 7,315 meters. Then they began to climb to the left, across a wide snow slope, towards the South Col. But the weather was terrible, and they were very tired. High winds blew down on them from the South Col. After 12 days of this, George Low was exhausted. But on the 21st of May, Anulu and Wilfred Noyce finally managed to cross the difficult snow slope and reach the South Col at 7,925 meters. Next day, Hillary, Tenzing, and 17 Sherpas followed them up to the South Col. The Sherpas had only a cup of tea for breakfast at Camp 7, after a long, cold night. They were carrying loads of 22 kilograms, with no oxygen. At the South Col, they made Camp 8. Then, the same day, they went down again to Camp 4. They had climbed for 10 hours, with no food or drink all day. But Camp 8 on the South Col was ready at last. Now, the attempt on the summit could begin. Chapter 9. The South Summit, 1953. On the 22nd of May, the first two summit climbers, Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans, set out from Camp 4 to the South Col. John Hunt and 2 Sherpas went with them, carrying heavy loads. Using oxygen, the 3 British men reached the Col first, but they were very tired. And when they took off their oxygen equipment, they could not think clearly. It took them over an hour to put up a tent in the terrible wind. When the Sherpas arrived, they collapsed in the tent and could not move. They rested for a day. Then John Hunt and the Sherpa de Namgyel set out to climb higher. They both had oxygen and were carrying about 20 kilograms. They moved very slowly, and Bourdillon and Evans soon came past them. Hunt and de Namgyel both had problems with their oxygen. Sometimes ice stopped it working, and it was very difficult to breathe. On they went, more and more slowly. At 8,338 meters, Hunt and de Namgyel could go no further. They put down their loads and turned back. When they reached the South Col, they could hardly walk. Above them, Bourdillon and Evans went on. At 1 o'clock, they reached the south summit, 8,750 meters. In front of them, they could see the final summit ridge. It was a view no man had ever seen before. To the left, a steep rocky slope fell 2,400 meters down to Camp 4 on the glacier. To the right, there was a line of white snow cornices, over a drop of 2,500 meters. Should they go on? This was their one chance to get to the top. But was it safe, or would they die, like Mallory and Irvine before them? They stood and looked and thought. Evans had already had trouble with his oxygen. Bourdillon had fixed it, but they did not have a lot of oxygen left. They thought it would take 3 hours to reach the summit, and 2 hours to get back to the south summit. By then it would be 6 o'clock, and they would have to climb down another 900 meters without oxygen to Camp 8. It was too far. So, sadly, they turned back. But it was the right thing to do. The wind grew stronger, and clouds came up. It was difficult to find the way. They were very tired, and several times they slipped on the way down. At one point, Evans slipped and fell. He slid past Bourdillon like a bullet and pulled him off his feet. A moment later, they were both sliding down the snow towards the glacier, thousands of feet below. Quickly, Bourdillon turned onto his face and dug his ice axe into the snow. The ice axe stopped them, but they had nearly died. Was this what happened to Mallory and Irvine 29 years earlier? They wondered. A sudden fall on the way down, and no one to help? It could happen so easily. When they reached Camp 8, they were exhausted. Their faces were covered with ice, and they could hardly walk. "They look like strangers from another planet," John Hunt said. But they had climbed higher than any man before them. Chapter 10. On Top of the World, 1953. Hillary and Tenzing were already at Camp 8, together with John Hunt, De Namgyel, and Ang Temba. Gregory and Low were there too, with 3 more Sherpas. But the weather was bad. A terrible wind blew straight across the South Col, and the temperature fell to -25 degrees Celsius. Hillary said that it was one of the worst nights he had ever lived through. No one could sleep. They sat shivering in their tents, hoping that the wind would not blow them away. Bourdillon and Evans were exhausted. 3 of the Sherpas were ill, and Hunt, like Ang Temba and De Namgyel, had now spent 3 nights at 7,925 meters. Next day, it was difficult for Bourdillon to walk, so Evans, John Hunt, and De Namgyel helped him and Ang Temba down to Camp 7. Gregory, Low, and 3 Sherpas spent another night at Camp 8 with Hillary and Tenzing. On the morning of the 28th of May, the wind began to fall. Hillary and Tenzing got ready to set out. Gregory and Low's job was to start first and make Camp 9, somewhere below the south summit. But 2 of their 3 Sherpas were ill, so Low, Gregory, and Ang Nyima carried everything between them. With their oxygen, they carried about 18 kilograms each. Hillary and Tenzing followed at 10 a.m., carrying about 22 kilograms each. Then, at 8,338 meters, they found the loads which Hunt and De Namgyel had left, and picked them up too. Now they were carrying 27 kilograms each. At 2:30 p.m., they found a small place for Camp 9, at 8,506 meters. Gregory, Low, and Ang Nyima dropped their loads and went down. Hillary and Tenzing put up their tent and crawled inside. The wind was very strong, and they were afraid the tent would blow away. That night, the temperature fell to -27 degrees Celsius. But by 4 a.m., the wind had stopped, and the sky cleared. When they opened the tent door, in the early morning sun, they could see the monastery at Thiang Boche, 4,878 meters below, where the monks were getting out of bed. They melted snow for a warm drink and checked the oxygen equipment carefully. Tenzing had worn his boots all night, but Hilary had taken his off, and they were as hard as ice. He had to heat them over the small cooker to make them soft. At 6:30 a.m. they set out, and by 9 a.m. they reached the south summit. They sat down and studied the summit ridge carefully. It looked frightening, Hilary thought. The snow cornices to the right were very dangerous. They were like fingers of soft snow, 2,500 meters above the valley below. And the rocks on the left looked very difficult too. But the snow just above the rocks looked better. Perhaps it was possible to climb there.